Once upon a time, there was a woman who had once ruled the palace from behind embroidered curtains and gold-trimmed veils. Her name was Maacah, daughter of Absalom, granddaughter of a king, mother to a king, and grandmother to yet another. People used to bow when she entered the room. Now, they barely looked at her, but Maacah still rose every morning before the palace drums sounded. She still combed her silver-streaked hair, wrapped her silks, and lit the incense in her private garden altar just like she had for years. She prayed to the goddess of fertility, the protectress of kings. She whispered the names of her ancestors. She laid the offerings gently, figs, oil, honey, and petals from the royal orchard. She believed it mattered. "I gave birth to this kingdom's heart," she often reminded herself. "I raised Abijah with these hands. I nursed his wounds when soldiers turned their backs. I sat behind the throne and made peace with his enemies." And now, her grandson, Asa, ruled. Maacah didn't dislike Asa. He had always been thoughtful, always respectful. But ever since his father died, something changed. He had grown cold toward the old traditions. He had stopped visiting her garden. He didn't even kiss her forehead anymore. It was as if her power had shriveled like a neglected vine. One evening, Maacah sat in her shaded courtyard, the wind barely moving the sheer linen canopy above. Her idol, a carefully carved pole with feminine curves and flowered etchings, stood before her, half lit by the soft orange glow of a nearby brazier. A young servant girl approached with tea but hesitated. "Set it down," Maacah said, waving her off. The girl placed the cup gently and bowed. "Forgive me, Queen Mother, but the priests are saying your offerings are not to the God of Judah." Maacah's nostrils flared. "They're saying that again?" The girl blinked, uncertain. "It's just King Asa, he—" Maacah stood slowly, tall and graceful, her spine straight like a blade. "Go," she said, voice quiet but firm. The girl vanished. Maacah turned to the idol and placed her palm on its smooth wood. She whispered, "They forget. They forget who kept this kingdom from tearing apart." When the soldiers whispered of mutiny, I silenced them. When the courtiers plotted, I smiled and redirected their steps. I have kept this house standing. She paused, eyes sharp in the dim light. If Asa wants to challenge me, he will find I am not made of dust. But somewhere in her chest, behind the pride and perfume, an ache stirred. A small ache she didn't speak aloud. A memory, uninvited. A younger Asa, maybe 9 years old, had once climbed onto her lap while she whispered old songs from her father's house. He had asked, "Is God like you?" And she had said, "He's bigger, but quieter. Like a shadow you can trust." That child now wore the crown. And he was no longer quiet. The sun did not rise over Maacah's garden that morning. Not really. A veil of thick early clouds pressed against the heavens like a lid, heavy and watchful. Even the birds had forgotten to sing. She sat alone by the alabaster fountain, dipping her fingers into the cold water. The ripples distorted her reflection, the lines around her mouth, the strength in her brow, the streak of silver in her braid. "They think I don't see," she muttered softly. "But I do." Behind the curtain of vines and blooming myrrh trees, she could hear the muffled sounds of sandals against stone, servants rushing, new guards stationed, and that particular hush that meant decisions were being made without her. Maacah rose and walked slowly toward the back of the palace where the smaller sanctum stood. A private chamber where she used to meet with foreign wives and noble women for prayer and counsel. The room was dim, perfumed, quiet. No one came there anymore. Her idol still stood there, polished with oil and wrapped in fine linen, the goddess of womanhood, the one who gave kings sons and mothers power. Maacah sat before it and closed her eyes. She didn't pray this time. She remembered. Her wedding veil had been scarlet and gold, long enough to trail down the palace stairs. Her father, Absalom, had insisted on it. "A king's daughter must never look common," he'd said, brushing a lock of hair from her cheek. "Make them bow before you, even when you say nothing." She had been 17 and terrified. They married her to Rehoboam to solidify the fractured kingdom. Maacah had not loved him. He had been harsh and impatient, but she knew how to survive. She gave him a son Abijah. She made herself useful. She studied every face in court and learned where the real power moved. Not in war rooms or royal feasts, but behind drapes, behind eyes, behind closed doors. She became queen mother before she was 30. And now Asa wouldn't even let her anoint the threshold at festival time. She opened her eyes and let out a long breath. The air smelled like cedar and something faintly sour, like pride left out too long. Then came the knock. Not a servant's knock. Number it was firm, confident. She turned slowly. King Asa stood in the doorway. For a moment, she thought he looked like Abijah. That same narrow face, those shoulders built more for robes than for armor, but Asa's eyes were colder, sharper, less trusting. "Grandmother," he said, his voice calm, but not soft. Maacah straightened, refusing to stand. "I wondered when you'd remember where I sit," she said. "I remember," Asa replied. "I also remember who you serve." She tilted her head. "I serve this house." "You serve a carved image," he said, "and you've placed it here, inside Judah's walls." She stood now, slow and regal. "And you think tearing it down will make you more holy?" she asked, her voice rising. "Will that make the kingdom safe? Will that bring rain or silence the enemies in the hills?" Asa didn't flinch. "No," he said, "but obedience might." Silence stretched between them like drawn arrows. Then Asa added gently, "I remember when I was a boy. You told me stories of your father, of the palace in Jerusalem. You sang the old songs. I loved them." Maacah's expression softened, just for a second. "But then I read the law," Asa continued, "and I realized you only gave me half the truth." Maacah turned away. "I gave you love," she said. "I needed truth," he answered. When she turned back, her eyes glittered, not with tears, but fire. "You think you're the first man to stand in that doorway and threaten me?" she asked. Asa didn't answer. "Then let me teach you one last lesson," she said. "You may wear the crown, Asa, but you were cradled by the woman who built this house with silence and skill. Don't forget that." Asa lowered his head, not in submission, but sorrow. "I haven't forgotten," he said. "That's why this is hard." And then he left. No threats, no guards, just footsteps echoing down the long hallway. Maacah stood in her empty chamber, the idol flickering in the brazier light. She reached out her hand toward it. But for the first time in years, she didn't touch it. Maacah didn't sleep that night. She sat upright in her chamber, listening to the palace shift and breathe without her. Torches crackled in their holders. The wind stirred through the narrow windows, tugging softly at the embroidered curtains. A servant passed once to offer her warmed milk. She waved him away without a word. In her lap sat a folded tunic, Asa's first, hand-stitched when he was still small enough to fit beneath her arm. She ran her fingers across the seams. She remembered how he used to trail behind her, one foot always slightly dragging. How he would sit wide-eyed during court meetings, clutching a fig in one hand and her wrist with the other. "I will be a good king," he'd said once, "not older than 7. And she had whispered back, "Then listen with both ears and speak with only one mouth." She had taught him that. Now he spoke like a prophet. When morning came, she rose without help. Her feet moved toward the garden but paused at the threshold. The scent of smoke met her there, strange, foreign. She stepped outside and saw the smoke was not from incense. It was from fire. Down below, in the grove near the priest's quarters, men were gathered, and in the center of them, her idol. Her idol! Ripped from its place, bound in rope and thrown upon a pile of broken wood and oil-soaked cloth. Flames danced along its carved edges as voices chanted psalms in a language that sounded like war. She didn't move. She didn't scream. She watched it burn. A soft gasp escaped her lips, but only she heard it. Later she sat by the stone basin near the inner courtyard, her hands folded in her lap. A few palace women passed by, whispering, their eyes darting to her and away. One bowed low. The others simply kept walking. No one dared look long. No one wanted to be seen standing too close to a falling tree. Then Asa appeared again, this time without his crown. Just a simple linen robe, his hair still damp from the morning wash. He stood before her quietly. "You could have sent guards," she said without looking up. "You could have stripped me in front of them all, shouted curses, banished me." Asa didn't answer at first, then he knelt. "I didn't want to dishonor you, grandmother," he said. "Only the idol." She finally looked at him. There was no fire left in her eyes, only embers, quietly cooling. "And what am I now?" she asked. "A woman with no altar, no seat, no name?" "You're still my family," Asa said. "But I cannot let your shadow be my covering. I must walk in the Lord's light." Silence settled between them, long and wide. She looked away, but not before he saw the tear that never quite fell. Then Asa rose and walked off, not triumphantly, not ashamed, just steady. Maacah remained by the basin, watching the reflection of the sky ripple in its surface. The clouds had cleared. The sun warmed her shoulders. For the first time in decades, she didn't feel like a queen. But maybe, just maybe, she could begin to feel like something else, something smaller, something truer. Maacah walked slowly that afternoon, through the corridors where she used to be greeted with whispers and bows, through the gardens where her statue once stood, through the carved halls of cedar that still bore the scent of her son's rule. But now, no one followed behind her carrying scented oils. No one announced her name. She carried her own silence. She didn't return to her private quarters. She went somewhere older, an empty stone room at the edge of the palace wall. It had no cushions, no incense, no embroidered tapestries, just dust and a crooked window carved centuries before. It was where she had once been taught how to pray as a girl, back when her mother was still alive, back when her grandfather David's songs were still sung every morning in the palace courts. She sat on the stone bench, tracing her fingers along the chisel marks on the wall. They formed words, words she had once known by heart. "The Lord is my shepherd." She hadn't spoken those words in years. A breeze moved through the narrow window, and Maacah closed her eyes. "Are you still watching, God of Judah?" she whispered. "Do you remember me?" There was no thunder, no reply, only the soft sound of birds outside and the creaking of branches against the wall. She stayed there a long time. When she finally rose to leave, a young servant, different from before, stood at the doorway. He looked nervous. "What is it?" she asked calmly. I was told to bring you this," he said, offering a folded cloth with fresh bread and oil. She raised an eyebrow. "Told by whom?" The servant hesitated. "The king, my lady. He said the days are getting cooler now, and the stone room can be harsh in the evening." Maacah took the bundle without a word and stepped past him. As she walked away, her voice floated behind her like a curtain on the wind. "Tell Asa, I never taught him kindness. That part he learned from someone else." That night she didn't return to her garden. She didn't light incense. She sat by the old window again with a small lamp and her thoughts, and slowly, almost by accident, her hands folded in prayer. Not to a carved pole, not to a goddess of rain or wombs or kings, just a prayer into the silence. No one saw. No one praised her. But in that small hidden room something began to shift. And this time it wasn't political, it was personal. The morning after, Maacah didn't rise before the palace drums. She lay still on the low stone bench in the old room, wrapped in her shawl, the tiny flame of her lamp still flickering beside her. The light had burned all night. For the first time in years, she hadn't kept her usual rituals, and the earth had not cracked open beneath her. She opened her eyes slowly, half expecting to feel guilt, but it didn't come. Instead, a memory came. She saw her son Abijah as a young boy, barefoot in the olive grove behind the palace. He had picked up a stick and declared himself a prophet, shouting verses he barely understood. She had laughed and clapped from the window. He was bold, fierce, and frightened of silence, just like her. But silence had come anyway. First with his illness, then his death. Now, her grandson ruled, and he didn't ask her advice. She stood and combed her fingers through her silver hair. This kingdom was changing. Later that day, as she walked through the shaded corridor that led back toward her rooms, she saw Asa in the distance. He wasn't wearing his crown, just a simple tunic, standing by a pile of broken idols. The priests were burning the pieces. The air smelled of ash and bitter oil. One of the carved poles had once been hers. Maacah stopped walking. "You could have told me." Asa turned. He didn't look surprised to see her. His voice was quiet. "I did, many times." She walked closer, slow and steady. "I am your grandmother, the Queen Mother." "You were," Asa said, "not cruel, just true." She swallowed. "Do you think power makes you wise, Asa?" "No," he replied. "I think God makes us wise, if we listen." The fire behind him crackled louder. She looked at the flames, then back at him. "And you believe I haven't listened?" Asa's face softened. "I believe you forgot who the real king is." The words stung, not because they were shouted, but because they weren't. Maacah stood still for a long time. Then she turned and walked back toward her private quarters. She didn't slam the door. She didn't cry. But later, when she reached the threshold of her garden, she paused. She looked at the empty place where the idol had once stood, and for the first time, she didn't miss it. She sat down on the edge of the garden path, watching ants carry crumbs beneath the stonework. "Maybe I did forget," she whispered, "but I want to remember." And the God of Judah, who listens even when no one else does, heard her. The next day, Maacah didn't light the incense. She walked instead. Down corridors she hadn't stepped through in years, past the upper court, through the passage where young noble girls used to dance in celebration during feast days. Everything looked smaller now. Or maybe she had grown, not in height, but in awareness. She passed a group of palace servants who stiffened when they saw her. She didn't speak, just nodded. She made her way to the archives, a quiet stone chamber tucked behind the scribe's quarters. No one expected her there. The air was cooler. The scent of old parchment and candle wax clung to the walls. An older priest, one of the few who had served both her husband and her son, looked up from a scroll. His name was Haniel. He blinked in surprise. "Queen Mother." "Maacah," he said gently, standing with respect but confusion. "I need to read," she said. "Not gossip, not poetry. I need to read the words Asa reads." Haniel didn't question her. He just gestured toward the shelf behind him. "They're here, the laws, the prophets, the early songs." She stepped forward, running her fingers across the scroll edges. "I've heard them sung, of course, recited in court, but I want to see them myself." Haniel gave her space. She selected one, weathered, and slightly cracked at the edges. She sat down at the table and began. At first it felt dry, like dust, like someone else's language, but then a phrase caught her breath. "And you shall have no other gods before me." She paused, swallowing hard. "You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness." Her fingers trembled slightly. She read on. Hours passed. She asked no questions. She just read. When her eyes grew tired, she leaned back and whispered aloud to the room, "I raised kings, but I never bowed like one." Haniel, who had stayed near but respectfully silent, stepped forward. "Would you like me to continue reading it aloud for you?" She looked at him. Not with pride, not with shame, but something new. "Please." And he did. The Queen Mother, once worshiper of carved poles and whispered rituals, sat at the feet of a priest and listened to the law of the god she had once overlooked. Outside in the royal courtyard, the afternoon sun was shining brighter than it had in days. That night, Maacah didn't sleep. She lay on the edge of her cushioned bed, staring at the carved wooden beams above, listening to the sound of the palace breathing, guards' footsteps, the faint rustle of wind in the outer courtyards, the hoot of an owl in the distance. Her mind kept circling back to one phrase, "You shall have no other gods before me." She had read it with her own eyes, heard it with her own ears. Not from Asa's lips, not from temple singers, but from the scrolls themselves. What did it mean for her? For the years she had poured oil and whispered prayers to carved wood, for the idol still standing in her garden, flowered, polished, beloved. She closed her eyes and saw Asa again as a boy, barefoot and curious, asking her about God. She remembered answering with half-truths wrapped in elegance. Had she taught him wrong? Or had he simply outgrown her version of faith? By morning, she still hadn't slept, but she knew what she had to do. She bathed in silence, chose a simple robe, no embroidery, no silk, just soft linen. She pinned up her hair and for the first time in decades left her gold rings in their box. She walked barefoot to her garden. The idol stood there, as it always had. Maacah stood before it, hands trembling, not from fear, but from decision. "I carried you in my heart longer than I should have," she whispered to it, But you never carried me. Not really." She took a breath and reached for the edge of the altar cloth. One by one, she removed the offerings, the petals, the bowl of figs, the polished stones. Then, gently but firmly, she wrapped her arms around the pole. It was heavier than she expected. She dragged it to the edge of the courtyard. A few servants saw and gasped, but none interfered. She laid it against the wall and covered it with the cloth. Then she turned and walked away. Later that day, Asa came to her chambers. He paused in the doorway, surprised to see her sitting by the open window reading again. "I heard," he said quietly. She didn't look up. "I suppose you would." He stepped further in. "You destroyed it?" She looked up then, not with defensiveness, not with shame, just calm. "I did what I should have done a long time ago." Asa's jaw tightened with emotion. He walked to her side and sat on the floor like he used to when he was little. After a long silence, he said, "You taught me strength, grandmother." "I taught you pride," she replied softly. "But God is teaching me truth." They sat there together, two generations of royalty, one old, one young, united not by power or politics, but by a quiet surrender neither of them had expected. And outside, the wind carried away the scent of old incense, making room for something new. Asa hadn't stayed long that day, but his silence had spoken more than a scroll full of proclamations. After he left her chamber, Maacah sat alone, watching the wind stir the branches of the olive tree in the courtyard. It bent, but didn't break. She thought that was how grace worked. You don't always recognize it when it comes, but it holds. Word traveled fast through the palace. Queen Mother Maacah had removed her altar. Servants whispered. Officials paused when they passed her. Some expected her to be bitter. Some expected her to scheme. But she did neither. She simply returned to her quiet routines, without the incense, without the idol, without the throne. One morning, as she passed the training yard, she noticed a group of young women watching the palace guards practice. She smiled faintly. She remembered what it was to be their age, hungry for beauty, for influence, for praise. One of the girls turned and saw her. The girl bowed slightly. "Lady Maacah." She nodded. "What's your name?" "Abiah, daughter of Hilkiah." "Do you read Abiah?" The girl blinked. "A little." "Come to my rooms tomorrow at sunrise. Bring 2 others. I'll teach you to read the sacred texts, not just the parts you've heard sung in the temple, the whole scrolls." Abiah's eyes widened. "Truly?" Maacah smiled. "I've spent a lifetime telling others what I thought God wanted. Maybe it's time I just let him speak for himself." That week, 3 girls came. The next, there were 6. By the end of the month, there were 12. Young women of the court, daughters of priests, nieces of gatekeepers. They gathered in Maacah's garden each morning, where the altar had once stood, and read the words of Moses and the prophets. Maacah no longer needed the carved pole or veiled power. She had something better, truth that could be passed down without gold or titles. One afternoon, Asa passed through the courtyard and stopped. The girls sat in a circle, repeating lines from Deuteronomy, their voices rising like birdsong. Maacah noticed him. She stood slowly. "You don't mind?" she asked. Asa shook his head, emotion tight in his throat. "Number, I don't mind at all." She stepped toward him. "I can't erase my past, Asa, but I can rewrite the ending." He looked at her for a long moment, then reached down and kissed her forehead like he used to. "You already have," he whispered. The palace garden was quieter these days, filled not with court gossip or the scent of burning incense, but with the rustle of parchment and the soft murmur of scripture being spoken aloud. Maacah now walked among the olive branches not as a queen mother, but as something different, something smaller perhaps, but also stronger. "Repeat the line," she told the girls as they sat cross-legged in the grass. "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength," they said in unison. Maacah closed her eyes for a moment, the words echoing in her memory. How many years had she loved other things more, her power, her pride, her tradition? But somehow, through the dust of her failures, the voice of God still called, and she was finally learning how to answer. One of the girls, Tirzah, raised her hand. "Lady Maacah, why did you stop worshipping Asherah?" Maacah paused. The wind teased a silver strand of her hair across her face, and she smoothed it behind her ear. "Because idols can't answer when you cry in the night," she said, "and they can't forgive you when you're wrong." Tirzah frowned thoughtfully. "But you believed for so long." "I did," Maacah nodded. "But belief isn't the same as truth. And truth, it has a way of waiting for you." She sat beside them, her silks rustling as she lowered herself onto the blanket. "I was proud," she continued. "I thought because I came from kings and raised kings, I was above correction. But no one is above the truth, not even me." Just then, a servant appeared at the edge of the garden. "Lady Maacah," he said softly, "the king requests your presence. He's in the chamber of records." Maacah's stomach turned, not with fear but with something heavier. She rose slowly, nodding to the girls. "We'll continue tomorrow." As she walked the stone path back toward the inner palace, memory stirred. That long hallway with the tall brass mirrors, she had once seen herself as untouchable there. That corner archway, she had stood beneath it the day Asa was crowned. And that door to the chamber of records, the last time she stood before it, she was the one giving orders. Now she knocked. "Asa," she said, stepping in. He was bent over a scroll, his brow furrowed, but when he looked up, his face softened. "I asked them to bring the genealogy records," he said, gesturing to the table. "I've been reading our family's history." Maacah waited, unsure where he was going with this. "You came from Absalom," Asa said, "from kings and warriors, but also from those who made mistakes." Maacah gave a sad smile. "I was one of them." He looked up at her. "And yet, you're the one helping the next generation know God. That's not a mistake." Maacah said nothing at first. Then, in a voice both quiet and steady, she replied, "Then let's write the rest of our story well." Asa nodded. "We will." The morning sun spilled across the stone walkway, warm and unbothered by the weight of royal matters. Maacah stood in the outer courtyard, her hands folded neatly before her. Around her, small groups of women gathered, some from noble houses, some servants, and even a few foreigners who had taken refuge in Judah. They came not for courtly duties now, but to learn. Maacah had begun teaching them. Not about altars or idols, not about politics, but about the living God. "He doesn't need carved poles or secret prayers," Maacah told them. "He's not tucked away behind curtains. He walks beside us, even when we're stubborn." One of the older women, Huldah, raised a skeptical brow. "But you were Queen Mother. You had power. Why give it up?" Maacah smiled, a knowing kind of smile. because that power wasn't real. Not compared to what I found now. I was proud until God stripped me down to truth. It hurt, but it healed me. Some women exchanged glances, murmuring. Others looked down, thinking. Behind her, Asa stepped quietly into view. He hadn't announced himself, but Maacah noticed him anyway. She kept her gaze ahead. "We've started again," she continued. "We're building something new, not with stones and thrones, but with repentance, with obedience." The group dispersed slowly, returning to their duties and homes. Asa approached. "I heard what you said," he told her. "I assumed you would." Asa chuckled softly. "They listened to you. Still, I don't want them to follow me," she said. "I want them to follow truth." There was a pause, a peaceful one. "You've changed," Asa said, not accusing, just observing. "I had to," she replied, "because I nearly lost everything." He looked down at her hands, weathered now, but still graceful. "I remember those hands cradling me when I had fevers," he said, "when Father went to war. You were strong then too, just in a different way." Maacah's voice wavered only slightly. "I tried to hold the kingdom together with charm and tradition. But Asa, only God can truly hold anything together." He nodded. "That's what I'm learning too." They stood for a while, not speaking. A breeze lifted the leaves in the courtyard. Somewhere, a dove cooed gently. "You know," Asa said finally, "the younger women want to start gathering in the evenings too. Maybe singing psalms, maybe learning from the priests." Maacah raised an eyebrow. "And you think I should lead that?" "I think I would be honored if you would." She didn't answer right away, but after a moment she nodded. "Then let it be a new kind of legacy," she said. Once upon a time, Maacah had chosen silence as her sharpest weapon, but now even her silence carried no weight. The corridors she once glided through like a queenly breeze now echoed with younger footsteps, priests with scrolls, servants with orders not her own. She had watched her influence fade like worn embroidery on an old tapestry. That morning she lit no incense. She sat instead on the edge of her couch, her hands folded in her lap, listening. There were murmurs beyond the curtain, voices speaking softly but not softly enough. "She's still keeping the idol in the garden. I thought the king told her, 'Shh, she's the queen mother.'" Not anymore, Maacah thought. Not in the way that mattered. Later, Asa visited. He did not enter with ceremony. No heralds, no greetings. Just his shadow moving beneath the canopy, followed by 2 Levites who stood silently by the entrance. Maacah raised her chin. "You've come." Asa nodded. He looked older than she remembered, lines at the corners of his mouth, tension in his jaw. "Grandmother," he said, "you know why I'm here." She stood slowly. "Then say it." Asa took a deep breath. "I'm removing you from your position as Queen Mother." The words did not sting the way she thought they would. They landed flat, like raindrops on stone. Maacah looked at him, really looked, at the boy she had once taught to walk the palace steps, now speaking as king, spine like cedar. "I see," she said. "You built a shrine to Asherah," Asa said. "You've led others to follow her. This can not remain." Maacah stepped past him, toward the garden. The idol stood crooked now, petals wilted at its base. For the first time, she noticed how small it looked in the sun. I tried to hold this kingdom together, she whispered. I did what I thought was right. And I'm doing what I know is right, Asa replied. Not just for the palace, for Judah, for God. Maacah touched the idol's surface with her fingertips. Then, without turning, she said, Will you destroy it? Yes. There was a long silence. Then she stepped back, hands at her sides. Then do it yourself. And she walked inside without another word. That night, no incense burned in the garden. Only smoke. Once upon a time, Maacah had believed her influence would outlast time itself. Now, the smell of burnt wood lingered in her private garden. The statue was gone. Only a dark patch of ash remained, and the flowers around it had shriveled from the heat. Servants avoided her eyes as they passed. The linen curtains that once framed her courtyard had been taken down, by Asa's order or by fearful hands she didn't know. She sat in the stillness, her back straight, eyes open. But everything inside her was tired. It wasn't only the removal from power, it was the loneliness that followed it. Maacah had never feared being challenged, but being forgotten, that was harder. She looked out at the garden wall. A fig branch twisted through one crack, its leaves wilting in the sun. She remembered planting that tree years ago with her son, Abijah. He was just a boy then, barefoot, muddy to his knees, holding the sapling like it was a sword. You're too proud, Abijah had once said to her just days before he died. The people don't follow incense and whispers, they follow fire. She hadn't understood him then. She did now. A soft knock on the stone pillar startled her. She turned. It was Asa, but not with guards. He stood alone, in a plain robe, no crown on his head. He looked like the boy again, the one who once ran to her with scraped knees and wild questions about God. "May I sit?" he asked. She nodded once. He lowered himself beside her, not too close. They said nothing for a long while. Then Asa said, "I didn't do it to dishonor you." Maacah didn't answer. Her eyes were still on the garden wall. "I did it because I had to choose," he continued, "between you and what God wanted from me." She finally turned to him. "And you chose God." "I did." Maacah studied his face. He looked so much like Abijah now, the same crease in his brow, the same quiet stubbornness. "You were right to do it," she said at last, "even if I hate how it felt." Asa looked down at his hands. I hated it too. For a moment, neither of them were royalty, just a grandson and his grandmother sitting in the ruins of what pride had built. "You were a good king today," she whispered. He didn't respond, but his hand rested gently over hers for a moment before he stood. She watched him walk away, disappearing into the brighter parts of the palace. And for the first time in a long while, Maacah closed her eyes and prayed. But not to the old gods, not to a carved idol, only to the one her grandson served. She didn't know if he would listen. But she spoke anyway. Once upon a time, Maacah thought she understood power. She had held it in silken fingers, spoken it through veiled commands, preserved it with careful alliances and whispered strategies. But power, true power, was not what she once believed. It wasn't held in statues. It wasn't passed through blood. It was bowed to. Maacah knelt in the garden that morning, though the altar was gone. The earth beneath her was still blackened from the fire. She touched it anyway, hands pressing gently into the scorched soil as she whispered, I don't know you, she said quietly, but Asa does. The breeze stirred the edge of her shawl. I don't have incense or chants or polished words, she added, her voice hoarse. But I have regret. A bird landed on the wall, one of the little doves that used to rest near the idol. It cooed, uncertain, then flew off again. I gave my life to protect a kingdom, she said, but I forgot who built it. Her voice broke, but she kept speaking. I want to begin again. She stayed like that for a long time. Alone, unguarded, unknown, but not unloved, not unseen. That afternoon, one of the younger palace servants crept into the courtyard. She paused, startled to see Maacah kneeling. Oh, I'm sorry, Queen Mother. I didn't mean to interrupt. Maacah looked up, blinking at the sun. You didn't interrupt, she said gently. You came at the perfect time. The girl hesitated. Do you need anything? Maacah thought for a moment. Then she smiled. Yes, she said. Bring me one of the scrolls Asa reads, the ones from the temple. The servant nodded slowly. You want to read them? I want to understand what I ignored. As the girl scurried off, Maacah sat back on her heels. The old woman who once ruled behind curtains was gone. But something new was beginning. Something better. She didn't know what kind of legacy she'd have, but this time it wouldn't be built on charm or control. It would be built on truth. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. Once upon a time, Maacah had been the most powerful woman in the palace. But now, the silence around her was not the silence of exile. It was the peace of release. Weeks had passed since the idol had been burned and the title Queen Mother removed. The public ceremony had been brief, Asa's words strong but sorrowful. He hadn't gloated. He hadn't punished. He had simply obeyed. And surprisingly, Maacah had felt lighter ever since. She now spent her mornings under the myrtle tree at the edge of the garden, no longer offering fruit to carve poles, but reading from the temple scrolls. At first she had struggled. The words felt foreign, too clean, too sharp. But each day they reached further into her heart, peeling away old layers of pride like weathered fabric from a throne long abandoned. One day Asa came, walking slowly, not as a king approaching a subject, but as a grandson returning to someone he had loved once. She looked up. I wondered when you'd visit again. He gave a small smile. I was waiting to see if you'd invite me. She patted the stone bench beside her. Sit, Asa. He did. For a long time, they sat without speaking. The garden was different now, cleaned, quiet, no altars, no idols, no perfume burning in the breeze. Only the sound of wind moving through leaves and the hum of life somewhere beyond the walls. Maacah broke the silence. I see now what I was protecting wasn't holiness. It was control. And control is a poor substitute for faith. Asa looked at her carefully. I didn't want to shame you. You didn't, she said. You freed me. He blinked. You mean that? I do. She reached over, her aged fingers brushing his. You made the harder choice, Asa. You chose God over me. And that, child, is the greatest honor you've ever given me. Tears welled in Asa's eyes, but he didn't let them fall. I've missed you. Maacah smiled, full and quiet. Then come back again. Sit with me. We'll read these words together. From that day on, Asa did return, And the people began to whisper a new story, not about idols or rebellions, but about a king who obeyed and a grandmother who repented. Maacah never ruled again, but her final days held more peace than all her years of hidden power. And sometimes when the sun dipped low over the garden wall and the breeze caught the edge of her shawl, she whispered the same words she had once told a little boy. He is bigger, but quieter, like a shadow you can trust. Only now she truly understood what that meant.